Welcome to another in our podcast series, Conversations with Sound Artists. This is Glenn Kiser. I'm the director of the Dolby Institute, and this is a co-production between the Dolby Institute and the SoundWorks collection. Really excited today to talk about sound for virtual reality. And the guest on the podcast today is Tim Gedemer, who is you kind of become the go-to guy for a high-quality sound for VR. Tim has got a very illustrious set of credits. Starting in sort of more traditional cinema post-production, you worked on Menace to Society and The Mask and Dumb and Dumber, and some amazing work on U571 in the sound design and sound effects editorial realm. And then you kind of moved into computer animation and digital stuff, and that's kind of led a segue for you into VR when it's still pretty early days in this field. So I'm really pleased that you could come in. We just finished VR LA.
Yes, we did.
Here in LA, and I'm grateful for you to come in and talk with us about sound for VR. How did that transition happen for you? How did you find yourself doing VR projects?
Well, first of all, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. How did I come to do VR projects? It's a good Dolby story, actually. A couple of years ago, probably in early to mid 2014, I got a call from, I can't remember exactly who it was at Dolby, but someone at Dolby called me and said, hey, we're working with this company called Jaunt, and they've got this virtual reality camera that they're doing experiments with and tests on. But now that they're getting close to actually having something that they can show, they're realizing that they need some sound work done. So they contacted Dolby to say, hey, we need to have some sound done on these experiments, these tests that we're doing. Can you help us with that? And so I forget who it was. It was.
But we're not really a post-production facility,
right?
Like
exactly.
That, so yeah.
So immediately the people who they contacted just happened to know us because we had been doing other work with Dolby for years on the feature film side and even on the game side, and they thought, well, this is virtual reality is kind of a little more technical. It's got an interactive aspect to it. There's maybe you want to talk to these guys, Source Sound. And so Jaunt called and said, hey, we've got this thing called virtual reality going on. We need to have some sound done. Are you interested? And I kind of looked at my watch and I said, well, we're really busy. We got all this other stuff going on. I don't even know what you're talking about. I've never seen it.
Yeah.
So why don't you hit me to what it is that you're talking about? And
this was 2 years ago.
This is over 2 years ago.
This is how fast this is.
This is how fast it's gone. Yeah, exactly. It seems in VR terms, in modern VR terms, it's like a decade.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they invite me up to San Francisco and to see the technology, and so I go up there. Still looking at my watch, checking my emails, doing all my traditional media stuff, and they bring me into this conference room, and they have this little viewer that they are showing their technology off in, and they strap it on my head, and they say, well, just look around for a little bit. I go, okay, I'll look around, and I start looking around. I'm like, is this live action? Did you guys shot? I've seen this kind of thing before in game engine and or in the game world of 360 visuals, but this is 3D visuals captured with some camera device, and it's seamless, and I don't see any seams. What are you guys doing here? And they explained a little bit about the technology, and it was really immediately within a minute of seeing it, I realized that we had to be a front runner and involved in it immediately. That sound was going to be critically important in bringing any kind of story, any kind of vision to life in this medium. Clearly, sound was going to be a big deal. So I was 100% convinced right on the spot as soon as I saw Jaunt's camera work for the first time.
And now Source Sound, which is your company, how much of your business is comprised of VR work at this point?
Right now, we're running at about 20% of our business is VR work,
yeah.
And it's growing. But the thing is, and that we're going to be chasing that percentage because the rest of our business is growing as well, right? So although VR has huge growth potential, it's it's growing at about the same pace as the rest of our company is. So if it gets to be more than 25 or 30% in the next year, I might be surprised at that.
Yeah. So those first pieces that you collaborated with Jaunt on, were those narrative pieces, or were they just sort of visual tests, or what was the content?
Well, there were I believe 4 pieces of content initially. There were 3 narrative pieces. One was a war type narrative piece called The Mission. Another was a horror piece called Black Mass. And the third piece was a monster movie called Kaiju Fury. Those were the first 3 that we jumped on. And crazy as it is, they called us. They wanted to do a demonstration during Halloween. And this was 2014 now, Halloween 2014. And I got the call about 10 days prior to Halloween for us to do all 3 of those pieces in one go. So, not only have we never done anything like this before, there weren't any tools available to do any of that work either.
Yeah.
So it was a big tech scramble for us to figure out what it was that we needed to do in order to achieve what they were trying to do, which was essentially, full spatial audio, and headphone playback.
So what they were trying to do at that point was to have a fully immersive audio environment in a 360-degree space that you could turn your head and objects would move.
Right.
And so how did you even? What was the lay of the land at that point in terms of the tool set that was available for you, and how did those first few pieces work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, when we first started this thing, we hadn't even heard of. I mean, my wife had heard of ambisonic audio because she had been using it in research, and some of her PhD friends had been researching ambisonic audio, over the years. But I wasn't really familiar with it myself, and so we had to get familiar with it really fast. And at that moment, there wasn't any other way for us to get something like that done in 10 days, other than to co-opt the ambisonic technology and use the head tracking capability and the rotational capability that it has in order to achieve what Jaunt was trying to do. At that time, Atmos wasn't available in that arena, right, although it was Dolby who provided the expertise technically for us to achieve the final result. If it wasn't for Dolby, it would not have happened, for sure, because we don't have engineers like that on staff.
Yeah, and it was a big science project, right?
It really was, yeah. And I'm sure, I remember late night phone calls to people at Dolby, engineers who were, scratching their heads and writing code as we were speaking, trying to get to the finish line while we were doing the creative work, they were doing the technical work. And we knew that somewhere around October 29th, October 30th, we were going to have to come together and say, okay, here's the track, and now it needs to be put in this format, and it needs to head track, effectively. So fortunately, Dolby has some great engineers, and they sorted that out quickly and were able to get us to the finish line, and they had a huge rousing success with those first 3 pieces.
So with those first couple of pieces, what worked for you about the format, and what were the biggest kind of stumbling blocks?
You mean in terms of doing the work?
Or even I'm curious about what worked for you creatively. Like what made you excited about trying to, like, other people could have said, like, oh, this is too much trouble, I'm taking my ball and bat and going home.
Okay, sure.
But what was it about the promise of sound for VR that kind of hooked you in, that made you want to explore it further?
Well, for sure, I was immediately intrigued with the idea that we were no longer working in channels. I always felt that channels were limiting. I always felt that we were moving towards something else. In my career, we've gone from stereo. We made the transition to digital pretty much at the beginning of my career, right around '88 is where things started going digital. And I never felt like 5.1 was really where we were going. And even to this day, I go to a movie theater, and it's not a particularly satisfying experience to me anyway, as a representation of the work that we do. I feel like virtual reality and the 360-degree environment is the place where we were going. Right? There isn't any place else that I can see where we need to go other than a full spherical image, non-channel based, and emulations of either reality or other realities. To me, that's where we were going. So I felt immediately a kinship with that because it resonated with me personally in my career. We're moving towards something. Where is it going? This, to me, that's where it was going for me personally. So, that's what attracted me.
Yeah.
Right away.
And on a technical side, kind of the challenges from from that first few projects that you'd have, those largely been solved, or what's the current state of the land for doing sound for VR right now?
Yeah, quite a few of the initial issues have been at least addressed. I wouldn't say they're all solved, but we're at least at a point where we can relatively easily create content and get it out to the world and have them view it in the proper way. That was definitely not the case when we started in 2014. There wasn't a portal where you could see it, where the public could see it. Gear VR didn't exist yet. Oculus hadn't been released or didn't exist yet, or it existed but cloaked. Some of the tools that we use to create the experiences have definitely moved forward in their usability and their feature sets. So we're very happy about that, but there's more work to be done. To be sure, my vision anyway about how we should be working in virtual reality is actually with an augmented reality system, where we're able to view our current mixing consoles and what it is that we're doing our work with, and we're also able to view the virtual reality content that we're working on, or the augmented reality content that we're working on in an augmented reality system, so that we don't have to leave our reality, put the headset on, view what it is that we're working on, then put the headset down.
Yeah,
it's cumbersome.
We're jumping ahead a little bit because I wanted to ask you sort of how these productions flow through. But
Sure.
The first time I watched you guys work, the first thing that popped out at me was like, oh, you have to take the headset off in order to see the mixing console to actually mix.
It seems obvious, that.
Yeah.
You don't
Once you think about it for 2 seconds, it was like, yeah, how do you, you're basically mixing blind.
Right.
So I think a lot of people who are in our audience that listen to this podcast know quite a bit about, a traditional sort of post-production model. So
Sure.
Can you just walk us through? So I guess, first of all, most of the stuff that you guys are working on, this 20% of your business that's VR, I'm presuming that's kind of linear, cinematic, mostly narrative.
It's split,
pieces?
Actually. It's split. We have 3 areas of VR that we work in. We work in game-based VR.
Okay.
We work in cinematic VR, and we work in live broadcast VR. So.
I want to talk about the differences in each one of those, but just for the sake of simplicity. So if we're talking about a cinematic linear piece,
right.
How does that come to you, and how does that workflow work, and how is it different from a traditional kind of workflow?
Well, how the jobs come to us are through relationships mostly. I've made a point since day one at Jaunt to develop the relationships that help us along in that arena, just making sure people know they have an audio option. Quite a few people have been focused on the visuals and how to achieve the camera work and all the technical details surrounding that. They forget that they need sound. So I try and inject that information to them early. And I've been making these relationships for the last 2 years pretty solid. So that's how those jobs are coming to us, is that people know that's what we do, and that we have the experience, having done upwards of 50 of these experiences now. we know what the pitfalls are. We know how to help direct people through the process, through production, file management, post-production.
Well, let's start at production. So you've got a team out in the field recording, typically with a 360 camera rig.
Sure.
And so that obviously, you start off with some questions right there, which is, where do you put the crew? Where do you put the microphones?
Oh, yeah.
What's the conversation that you have with these production folks about capturing sound in the field?
Okay, so the conversation goes something like this.
You need sound.
What's your script? What's your script? And let's go over it and see where we have opportunities for sound. And let's go over it and make sure we understand that in your setups, you're not impeding sound's ability to capture on the set. And there are considerations that happen at that point that they haven't even thought of visually yet, because they haven't. Some of the people haven't been through it yet. And so they don't even know from a camera standpoint what the challenges are going to be.
And they're just trying to figure out how the hell do we do this thing.
They're just trying to figure it out. So we basically audio direct, and we say, get us involved right from the beginning before you start shooting. We go over the script with them. We say, here are the concerns from an audio standpoint. You might want to think about, this setup, this setup, this setup. We would prefer that you do it this way. In this particular case, are you going to use a Jaunt camera? Are you going to use a Nokia Ozo? Are you going to use your own proprietary camera? Do you have a GoPro rig? You do some of it 360, or you can do some of it, in stereoscopic. Or you
does that affect how you capture sound on the set?
It does, and the main reason it does is that we have to be as stealth as everybody else. When the crew scatters, well, we can't. Not only can we not have, any microphones in a 360 image, but we also don't want any cables.
Right.
And so there are power considerations.
There's no boom guy there.
There's no boom guy. Yeah, that's not happening. Not an option. So for example, if they're going to use a Jaunt camera, we know the Jaunt has a certain dimension, and that dimension allows us to put a certain type of mic rig underneath the camera at camera position.
Because there's a blind spot.
There's a blind spot at the bottom.
Got it.
And the Jaunt, there's a spot logo that they put at the bottom of the experience. So when you look straight down,
you see a logo.
You see kind of a logo, and so people will use that for branding. Jaunt has been using it to brand their own, camera rig and whatnot. But when people actually use the Jaunt camera to do that, they can either fill it with a plate of information, so you're kind of floating in air. You'll
right.
maybe see the ground
right.
below you.
Right.
But it can be very disorienting for people to feel like they're floating. Like when they look down, it can make them a little ill.
Yeah.
So one of the other options that they give is to just make a blind spot down there. And sometimes the producers and the directors want the blind spot there anyway, because they need to hide some stuff down there too.
Sure.
They have battery packs and other camera oriented things that need to sit down there underneath the tripod.
Yeah.
So
you can hide some shotgun mics down there maybe, or whatever.
We usually put an ambisonic mic at camera position. If it's a multi-camera shoot, we'll have an ambisonic mic.
And an ambisonic mic, for those who don't know, is basically it's omnidirectional.
Yes, it's basically a specific format of recording that allows you to have some flexibility in post, where there are tools out there to allow you to manipulate that image after the fact. Kind of like a dual MS setup or something, but it's a specific WXYZ format that was developed in the 70s, so just the geometry of the camera rig makes us make a decision about what mic rig we're going to put underneath the camera. So if we can, we'll use a sound field mic under camera position, because we like the quality of the audio that's associated with those microphones. But if we have a Steadicam shot and we've got a Steadicam operator who is concerned about weight on his rig, we're not going to use the sound field because it's just too bulky and heavy. So then we'll use a little Tetra mic, which is a really small version of an ambisonic microphone. at camera position while he's moving around in 360 space. So.
And do you also have wireless mics on your performers?
Right. Yeah. So that's the other part of the equation.
And the production sound mixer is somewhere off, out of range. Right?
That's the other thing. I mean, number one, we can't have any cables, so that means everything's wireless. And number two, we don't have any boom, which means that typically boom and lav are kind of redundancies for each other.
Right.
But without the boom, that means you don't have any redundancy. So now you're double challenged. You don't have a redundancy on the lav side, and you have to be further away from mic position because you can't be seen by the camera.
Right.
Right. So it could be anywhere from just around that little corner, 4 or 5 feet away, or in some other kind of shot, you might be 30, 40, 50 feet away. Mm-hmm. And so you've got even more challenges now put on that.
Then you're subject to RF interference and all those sorts of things.
More challenges on the wireless system. So then, from our standpoint, we don't want problems in post. We want this to be captured as accurately and as high quality as possible.
But it's a lot harder to get good audio, to get good production tracks in VR.
Yeah, in that respect, it is. There are a lot of different things, but one of the challenges is the robust wireless aspect and keeping the redundancy. So we invested in a system that has that has a little microchip at the microphone itself, so that it records directly at the mic and it records wirelessly. So if we have any problems with the wireless, wireless transmission,
you've got a local.
We actually do have a local backup,
yeah.
Right? So to us, that's a critical system.
That's clever.
Yeah, it's very, very clever. We're happy that a company decided to do that. There's only one, and so we employ that system, religiously.
Yeah.
On VR sets.
And so then they move into post-production, and is the edit? So what's the editing process for you in post-production? Is it sort of echo a traditional model? Do they go off and edit and lock the picture and then hand it over to you, or how does that work?
It's interesting. We benefit from the difficulties associated with the visuals because the options to change right now are very few and far between at the last minute. Right. Last minute changes in VR are kind of an oxymoron, because if you change something at the last minute, then you've got to push your deadline out, because to stitch more video at that high quality level.
This turns out to have a great benefit for you because they're not changing picture until the last second.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that will change with auto stitching and people who are less concerned about the perfection of those stitches. The last 15% of perfection costs a lot of money.
Sure.
You can get to 75% or 80% these days of a stitch, almost automatically. And so for the people who are creating content who are okay with that 80%, they'll be able to make their changes at the last second just like anybody else. Mm-hmm. But for the people who really want that perfection and don't want your eye to be caught at all with any of the stitch lines, we do benefit from the fact that they really have to do that stitching ahead of time. Mm-hmm. So we have more time with final picture, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, even in those circumstances, we're working on projects as we speak where we're working with traditional film directors who are not used to having to make those decisions like that. So their entire process of evaluating footage, of making their creative decisions, are all so well conditioned by traditional film,
right?
That they are applying those exact habits to VR and stumbling, because the minute that they're used to making last second decisions, it's almost like a forced creative decision. Oh, you're putting a deadline on me? All right, I'll have to really look at this now.
And also they have to really wrap their head around it's a completely different aesthetic, right? You can't
For sure.
you can't
For sure.
you can't cut the way you're used to cutting.
No.
You're not using close-ups in the same way. It's really a completely different visual language.
It is, and for those who have decided to tackle it, they're all experimenting right now. Really, I mean, and this is going to be going on for quite a while as more established directors who are focused on doing traditional media, film and game work or whatever, and they start dabbling in VR. We're going to see again more experiments. They don't know what to do with this yet. They need to get an idea of how to wrangle it. So we'll be working on projects with directors, established directors, that essentially are proof of concepts for them.
Right.
And that's going to go on for a while.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people have been saying, well, this is going to be interesting to see what happens with VR when we get it into the hands of, professional narrative storytellers.
Absolutely.
And that is an interesting possibility, but at the same time, they've got to unlearn a lot of, of the tricks of the trade that they're used to using.
Right. No, that's true. I mean, just as a quick example, one of the things in sound that we noticed immediately on the very first project that we worked on with Jaunt is that creating energy in a 360 space is a very different thing than creating energy in a 5.1 or stereo type environment. It's a whole lot easier to create energy in the more traditional formats, but in 360, you don't have the same buildup of energy in some one location.
You're talking about buildup of energy using like tones and ambiances, or like a bit of a subwoofer, or like what do you mean?
Well, what I'm saying is that when in a film, for example, we have a big rectangle in front of us,
right.
and so from a physical standpoint, we use the space between the left edge of the screen and the right edge of the screen, and the top edge and the bottom edge of the screen as the place where we focus the most energy. Right? It's where the visual exists. It's where we get our information story-wise. And
even from an audio perspective, probably 80% of the information is coming from the center channel.
Well, this is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Even so, even the center channel is doing a lot of work.
Right.
A lot of film, people are putting the dialogue in the center. They're not putting a lot of sound effects in the center, but they're still in that rectangle shape, automatically putting lots of energy into that rectangle, right? In the theater. So in VR, we don't have that rectangle.
Right.
So we're accustomed to putting tracks together in a way that are layered and put together in such a way as to make sure that rectangle is filled with the right energy, right? And then people use the surrounds as support. Typically, they're not generally using the surrounds as big storytelling.
Right.
Space back here. So, and there are mixers who, certainly exploit the surrounds, and we love those guys. The more the better, as far as I'm concerned.
But it's not always appropriate to the story.
It's not always appropriate, and it can be distracting to the story.
Right.
Yeah. So, but in VR, since we don't have any particular rectangle,
no frame.
There is no frame. There's no place for us to focus our energy in the story, and so that gets spread out across 360 degrees of space, and for audio, that means that that it can feel a little what's the word? Underwhelming,
like diffused,
or a little diffused, or not as energetic.
Right.
So you have to go further and out of your way to try and prop up that energy in 360 space, because you may have a big chunk of space over to your right that has nothing going on.
Right.
And it's awkward for people to hear things in that way. It throws you off on your overall perception of energy in the space. So we have to think about these things, and we have made a point to fill some of those negative spaces with sound.
Yeah.
Whether it's relevant to the story or not, we can't ignore it.
Right.
Right.
Because it's there. Yeah.
It's there. It's affecting our perception of what's going on in other areas of the 360 space. And so this is all moving.
Right.
Right. It's all shifting and moving at all times. So when So when the action may shift from from the left side of the sphere to the right side of the sphere, well, the left side now is the negative space.
Right.
And so it's a constant process of updating our energy as we go.
But sound in this world has an interesting possibility that it doesn't really have in traditional cinema-based narrative, which is because you're existing in a 360 field, you can use the sound as a tool to direct the attention of the audience to something that you want them to see.
Absolutely. In fact, this is going to get into another thing that I've talked about before, but I'll talk about it here again as well for the benefit of the viewers. There's something that I call persistence of information. And when we first get into a virtual reality experience, most of us, because we're conditioned to see media on rectangles, either our phone, the
TV,
theater,
right.
TV, our computers, they're all rectangles. So we're so conditioned to look somewhere for our information and kind of fix ourselves in that position. So I tell directors right out of the gate, you need to calibrate the viewer right when they get into VR for the first time, because most of the people right now who are going to watch your experience will not be sophisticated VR listeners. For a long time now, we're going to have millions of people coming online, listening and viewing VR experiences for the first time.
Right.
So for quite a while now, we're going to need to get people accustomed to listening and thinking about things in a different way. So the very first thing that I try and encourage directors to do, maybe in the first 30 to 60 seconds of their experience, is to immediately calibrate the viewer that you are not going to get your information just from one area. You're going to get your information from all directions. So immediately get them used to that, right? So that when you do want them to look behind them based on an audio cue, they know that there could be a really important piece of information back there. Because if you allow them to get comfortable with a certain area, it could be 110 degrees of information, it could be 180 degrees of information, but if they get too comfortable in this area where there's a persistence of information that you're giving them, when you need them to look behind or you need them to react to an audio cue, they will not react, even if it's really loud, because they know the most important information is going to be happening over here.
It's really interesting. I'd never thought about that, but I'm thinking about my own experience of watching VR, the first few VR pieces. My first thing was like, okay, where am I supposed to look? Okay, I get it. That's kind of in this field.
Right.
And I kind of settle in.
And you settle in. Yeah.
Right.
And that's the thing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't believe that that there's any one way that we should be using VR as a media. I think it should be used in whatever way people feel creatively they want to use it. But I will say that if your intent is to in the trajectory of the overall experience, is if your intent is to have them looking around in all directions, eventually in your experience, you should really calibrate them relatively quickly. Otherwise, they'll miss important pieces of information. I mean, if you're going to give them visuals that are going to be behind them, they'll completely miss it.
Yeah.
Completely miss it. Not even if with a loud
they won't turn around.
Cue, they just won't turn around.
That's interesting.
They won't turn around.
So what's the let's talk a little bit about the mixing process and how that works, or in some ways doesn't work very well.
Sure, absolutely.
So in the traditional model, your sound editors have gone off, they've prepared their tracks, and then you move into a mixing stage, which historically has been channel based, but now with Dolby Atmos from the object based systems is moving away from that. But it's still a traditional box that you go in, and that's where you make decisions about where sounds are placed and EQ levels and various loudness levels. How does that process work in VR?
We've moved in and out of different processes over the last couple of years. One of the things that we've come to really understand acutely is that we need to do some research on the headphone side ourselves, because there are just so many different headphones with different EQ curves associated with them that we haven't come across one that has a kind of a global translation of all the media that the different outlets and the different media that we create. So what that means basically is that we're relying on our speaker systems for a while, set up in
the in-room monitoring system, the speakers in the room. You're talking about.
Speakers in the room, yes. When we use Atmos, we use our speakers, our small room speaker setup in Atmos to be able to really understand how things are going to translate, because we know the speaker system, we know how that translates to different environments and whatnot. The headphones are, we just have to do more research. I know there's good stuff out there, and that's one of the problems, that there's just so many different good ones.
Yeah.
That there's an evaluation that needs to happen. In other words, rather than mix on headphones.
Because nobody likes to mix on headphones.
Well, I mean,
but
no.
But the truth is,
it doesn't bother me.
Almost all of the audience, that's how they're experiencing the pieces,
yes,
right? So
yes.
all the flavors of VR today are really you put on the visor,
right?
You put on the headphones,
right.
And that's how you experience it.
This is true. But that's such a dramatic difference between one headphone and to the next.
Right.
If somebody's got Beats, the low frequency information that we put into an experience will be reproduced on a set of Beats headphones, completely different from a Harman set, completely different from a Bose set, completely different from a Pioneer set. And this is a big problem for us, because the perception of how our experiences play is directly related to the quality of the headphones.
Right. And certainly if they're doing Google Cardboard with a set of earbuds, it's...
There you go. I mean,
yeah.
The good news is that, unfortunately, the generation that is coming up is used to hearing crappy audio. And I say that we have some time.
Breaks my heart.
I know, it's terrible. But we have some time to sort out how to calibrate ourselves that way.
Optimize experience.
How to optimize that. And we're audio professionals. We know how to get to 80%, 90% pretty easily. But when Beats has a and they're not all like this. There's certain models have EQ curves where they have a 3 dB bump at 80 hertz.
Right. Because you got to have that kick and bass.
Exactly. They're counting on the musicians and the and the hip hop artists and whatnot to exploit that.
Right.
And people love bass, right? So, but for a piece of cinematic, soundtrack, that's a disaster.
It turns to mud.
That's a disaster. Yeah. So we have to sort out our own recommendations, and I think as a community, we also need to sort out for the public what they should be listening on, so that they don't have to try and willy-nilly just choose what looks cool, but they can say, all right, this is a set of headphones that you use for VR, and this is why. Because all of the people who are creating the content are using one of these 4 sets of headphones. Right. These are the approved ones. So this is work that we need to do as an industry.
Yeah.
Is help sort that out for the consumer.
Yeah. So you're mixing and say, for the sake of argument, that you're in a near field Atmos room and you're monitoring through the in wall speakers.
Yeah,
you're mixing.
We do both. I'll switch between the headphone binaural render and speakers.
Yeah. So I was about to say, at what point do you sort of because then you had the added layer of complexity of at some point you need to start making decisions about if I move my head, things track. So how does that get introduced into the mixing process?
Well, right now we're the binaural render that we listen to is not head tracked. So this is another reason why it's good for us to be able to reference headphones, because all we have to do is turn our heads and everything is where it's supposed to be. I'm sorry, on speakers.
Right.
So in the room we can just look around.
Sure.
And we don't need to rely on any tech for it to head track. It's already automatically doing it, right?
Yeah.
so we have those two scenarios, and over time we'll be able to get real-time head tracking as well. But for the time being, anyway, in the systems that we use, there's no real-time head tracking while we're mixing.
Right.
Yeah. We can get the binaural render in real time, but the head tracking's
so there's a little bit of guesswork in the mixing process.
Yeah, a little bit, and although it's fair to say that we haven't used every system that's out there either. So
right.
There are different ways to do this stuff, and we haven't for example, we don't really get involved in the PC-based solutions,
mm-hmm.
and there are presumably some PC-based solutions to cinematic VR that we're just not familiar with that may have solved some of these other problems. That,
I'm curious. The language, the visual language, and the audio language is so different from traditional storytelling. What's the role of music in cinematic VR?
It's really just starting to. People are just starting to look at that as the fact that it can play a different role. I'm personally very excited to see what we can do with that. Some of the projects we're working on right now are exploring these alternate ways of dealing with score.
Because I've definitely heard people say, I think there's certain less creative people who say, well, you can have diegetic music, music that's naturally existing in the space through a radio or whatever that you actually see. But
sure.
You shouldn't. There's no room for traditional scoring in cinematic VR.
I highly disagree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that defines cinematic VR is a good score, mm-hmm. and it can be anything any film would be. And evoke the kind of emotions and feelings that any film would. It's the spatial placement. That's what's awkward for people. How do you place the music?
Where do you put it?
Where do you put it? Right?
Yeah.
Where do you put it? If your goal is to create an experience that is of an emulation of some other reality, when you put music into, no matter where you spatialize it, when you put music into a space, then you're being told, I should be feeling like this. Or
right. It's a cue
that you're not in a real space anymore. So there are people who are focused on doing virtual reality experiences that are direct transportations of you to another reality. And those people are kind of purists, where they will say, the minute that you put a piece of music in here, that's
it's artifice. It separates you from.
Yeah, you're already in a narrative.
So you did Rose Trochet's piece,
yes.
Perspective 2, which premiered at Sundance
yes.
Earlier in the year, and that was a really interesting piece because it was a story about a police shooting, robbery kind of situation. And the thing that Rose did that was really interesting from a narrative standpoint is sort of a Rashomon kind of way. You can experience the piece several different times from different perspectives of the people who participate. But that's kind of what you're talking about in terms of there's sort of a verite aspect that she was trying to get at. I don't remember, there was no music in that,
no,
was there?
No.
So the whole point was we want this to be as authentic and realistic and transportive an experience as possible.
Right. Yeah, in that case, Rose was really focused on trying to evoke the emotion of and reveal something about people in the context of this altercation that happens between the police and the two brothers, and the whole point of it was to blur the lines of empathy, mm-hmm. For her.
Right.
We want to feel like the cops were justified. We want to feel like the kids were wronged, right? Both in the same experience,
mm-hmm.
and then we're left kind of unnerved about the whole process, that we can see how these things can happen, that in a split second a decision can be made that can have these kind of ramifications.
So that was a super intense piece. It was very emotional.
Yeah.
But you don't have, I think for a lot of storytellers, music would be a way to kind of heighten that sense of tension, that
Sure.
kind of, but you don't
But
have
then you're
that.
in a movie.
But then you're in a movie, but you don't
movie.
have that as a crutch. So from a sound
Yeah.
perspective, what did you do to kind of take the audience to that same heightened emotional place if you don't have the crutch of music to lean on?
Sure. Well, I mean, certainly good filmmaking is a big part of it. You have to make the right choices in terms of editorial and pacing and
Performance, obviously.
and performance, of course. So starting with those decisions, which are what I would call more traditional storytelling filmmaking decisions, and there was a lot of discussion about how to go about this project, and Rose struggled herself with trying to piece everything together in a way that was compelling, and didn't fall flat in
Right.
any one particular spot. But we did all sorts of things in that project. In sequences prior to the actual shooting, for example, we had energy that we wanted to evoke, right? So one of the things that we did was as during the police officers' perception of the neighborhood was different from the kids' perspective of the neighborhood. So when we were,
So they're hearing different things.
they're hearing different things in the
Interesting.
neighborhood, right?
Right.
So the cops hear a ghetto, not ghetto. She hates when I use that word, but a kind of an deep urban, troubled area is
Right.
what
So
the cops heard. But
they're hearing maybe threatening things. in
They're
the
hearing
environment.
threatening
So
things,
that put
but-
them on an alert.
But the kids, this is their neighborhood.
Right.
This is where they grew up. So when we were in the kids' perspective, we had birds, the kids playing
Right.
in the background. This is what they hear. They hear a non-threatening environment. This is where they live.
Sure.
So just doing those two things back and forth, depending on what perspective we were seeing at the time, which camera whose head we were on.
Yeah.
Without any performance, without any other thing, you just take all the voices away and just listen to the background track. Just the backgrounds alone were shifting like this back and forth between a threatening environment for the cops and a calm environment for the kids.
And that's something that the audience may not be consciously aware, but it's having a profound effect on them.
Exactly. So it makes you feel more uptight, more nervous. You hear people shouting across the street.
Mm-hmm.
They're having an argument. You hear more sirens.
Mm-hmm.
As things were moving toward the moment of altercation, we had dogs barking. One dog would start barking, and then another dog would start in over here, barking at the other dog, right?
Yeah.
And these things,
You just create this sense of chaos in this.
building this tension, building
Yeah.
until that moment where they finally start fighting with each other. Yeah.
So what are you looking forward to in terms of how the process is going to advance? What do you think is coming that's going to make the job easier or more engaging for the audience?
Well, certainly. I mean, I would say there are two aspects to that question. The first is, what do we see in terms of tools to make our job easier?
Right.
There are so many companies involved in making tools and different processes for us. I can imagine that within a year's time, we'll be even more in a position to be able to smoothly create virtual reality content on par with how we do it for traditional media. I'd say we probably need another year. We need some kind of way to be in virtual space while we're working.
While you're working.
That
Yeah.
might take a little longer. But for the time being anyway.
And it could be some sort of AR thing with overlays so that you can still see the mixing console, but have the
Yep. Yeah. I mean, if I had my druthers, I'd call HoloLens and have them develop an app for me that would allow me to see the 360 video in 360 in the HoloLens while I was able to
Look
continue
down
to work.
at the
look down and continue my work. So just haven't had a chance to talk to those guys. Anybody listening, give me a call.
You could make $1 billion.
But beyond that, finally starting to see some experiences that are using virtual reality as almost as a genre within itself. They are using VR to depict VR experiences inside of the actual experience. So the characters are viewing things in VR, are viewing things in AR, right? It's a future vision rather than using it as an empathy machine to show you what someone else's life is like, or to transport you to some location that you may have never seen before. These guys are using it as a vision of the future to say, okay, well, we're not in today's time, but we're somewhere in the future, and we're integrated. We're using VR and AR every day. I'm really excited to see experiences that are based around that, because to me, the being in VR, to see people using VR and AR, there's a synergy there of storyline that clicks.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested to see more of that kind of content, and also interested to see higher levels of acting, higher levels of production value, higher levels of directorial vision put on VR. Because every time I see a little chunk of it, of somebody who I know and is established and dabbling, it's like a little window into, yes, we need to go further down
here's
that
what
road.
It could be. Yeah.
Here's what it could be, and put all of those things onto VR that film already does.
Yeah.
It will be amazing. It will be amazing. But it's a money thing right now.
In what sense?
There's very little money to invest in all of that production value.
Right, because nobody's monetizing content right now.
It's not happening on the other side. There aren't enough eyeballs.
Right.
So a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines because of that reason alone.
Yeah.
They see the technology, like, yeah, this is great, but I got to be doing my high level projects over here.
Sure.
That make me the money that
people
I make.
are dabbling right now.
Yeah, there's still a dabbling sense, but someone somewhere along the way has got to raise their hand and say, we believe this to be the future. We're going to pour big money into this that is on par with normal feature film work.
Yeah.
Millions for one project. That's not happening yet.
Well, I'm kind of curious. You talked earlier about, you guys are working in what right now is all three flavors of VR. You got the cinematic stuff, you've got the game engine driven material, and then you've got live VR. And I'm just wondering if, this is a whole separate conversation, but it may be that one of those other genres may take off.
Oh yeah.
In a much more dynamic way than cinematic VR. But from your perspective,
yes.
What are the differences in working in those three flavors? And I'm sure we could have a whole hour-long conversation just about that.
We certainly could.
Just at a very basic thumbnail sketch, what are the differences between the three flavors?
Well, the game-based VR, let's take that one first, since we haven't really talked about that. In a lot of ways, that looks like traditional game development. So a lot of the skills that we use to do in-game work for the AAA games that we work on, same skills apply there.
So it's obviously it's nonlinear, it's interactive. You're building audio events in a game engine that are triggered by certain events happening in the gameplay.
Right, and the main difference is that we make more detailed choices about spatialization, about how we're going to spatialize, and if we want to take ambisonic recordings into that space and head track all of those recordings, that will complicate the process a little bit, and how we spatialize and head track that material inside the game engine. But by and large, it's very much the same as making a game. So not a huge amount of difference there. The cinematic arena we've been talking about, changes to the production, also, making sure that we have separation on the set. That's another thing that's a real can be a real difficult thing if we have overlaps in lavaliers.
Yeah.
So we have to talk to directors about that, about how they're blocking out their dialogue.
Right.
And if we can get them to not overlap each other, great. But for, let's say, a comedy troupe,
that's what they're going to do.
it's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
That's what makes it funny. We just have to deal with it. So there's the tricky business there. And of course, the challenges that we've talked about on the post-production side,
Yeah.
to get the cinematic VR to work in the end.
Right.
On the live VR side, I mean, the main challenges, of course, are being able to cram that information down a pipeline that can actually be put out in broadcast. So
Right.
For us, our part of it is mixing.
Is this basically going to be sports? Is that kind of what we're talking about mostly, or what would a live piece of VR be?
Sports for sure. It's a gigantic market there, but also live music.
Okay.
Live music. And in fact, that's the one I'm mostly interested in. I would
Sure.
love to reinvent how sports are being done, because I'm not satisfied at all with the way sports broadcasts are captured and delivered right now.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of complacency in that in that field. I think there's a lot of reinvention that is possible.
Sure. That technology hasn't changed much.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, really, there's, I won't go into it, but in a general sense, I think that's ripe for reinvention. I feel the same way about music and live music performance, and how that gets transmitted live, on pay-per-views or just in general through a YouTube link or something. This is also something that we're very interested in completely reinventing. Most of if not all of the live broadcasts that happen are either stereo or occasionally 5.1, but even rarely, very rarely 5.1. It's almost always just traditional stereo. So what we want to do and on the live side is just reinvent that process entirely by showing people what it would sound like if we were tracking everything in 360 space in real time,
Mm-hmm.
And giving everybody the proper perspective based on the camera position.
Right.
And that's a challenge. So we like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, we're just talking about professional content. It seems like, to a certain degree, the Facebooks and the Googles are really trying to encourage the start of an industry that doesn't really exist right now, which is user-generated content
Right.
in VR.
Right.
And is that really just going to be basically? I mean, what do you do with that? That's just basically an ambisonic microphone setup, and it goes out that way?
It goes, any which way. If someone's actually, sophisticated enough to have an ambisonic rig, yes, it can have. But the throw of the ambisonic microphones is only a handful of feet.
Yeah.
Beyond 5 or 6 feet from the microphone, you're going to get more background noise than you're going to get dialogue. So it's going to be, I think anyway, just like other traditional media, where you're going to have a ton of low rent stuff out there,
Right.
Do-it-yourselfers having fun,
Yeah.
and posting to YouTube.
Well, because none of the tools that you use that have been developed in the last couple of years are in any, even in the prosumer editorial systems like Adobe Premiere.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no way to do audio for VR within those platforms right now.
Not really. I mean, people, now that Facebook has bought Two Big Ears,
Yep.
There's a path for people to use something that doesn't cost them anything in order to create a track like that, an ambisonic track. But our belief is that ambisonic is a limited format, and it's not an object-based format.
Right.
So very shortly here, what's going to happen is that there's feature sets that will be available in other technologies that ambisonic just won't be able to achieve. And eventually, certainly all the professionals will want the highest level of feature sets possible.
Of course.
So they'll reject ambisonic as a distribution platform for them, and they will go with other other technology that offers them a more rich feature set. For sure. Yeah.
More ability to contour and change and more control over the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. More creative.
Yeah.
Just
Possibilities as well.
more things it can do. Yeah. Yeah. No doubt.
So, Tim, thanks very much for joining us today to talk about the kind of the state of the state for sound for virtual reality and all of its different flavors. It's been, I've learned a lot today, so I appreciate your coming by and talking to us. This is Glenn Kiser from the Dolby Institute, wrapping up this episode of the podcast, our co-production with Mr. Michael Coleman and the SoundWorks collection. We'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks.
Thanks so much.